The chandeliers sparkled like constellations above polished tables of marble, where laughter and expensive wine flowed without pause. At the entrance stood Daniel Reyes, his coat frayed, his shoes worn thin, yet his eyes steady and calm. He asked politely for a seat, just a corner at the far end. But Richard Voss, the millionaire host of the evening, smirked for all to hear. "This isn't a shelter," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "People like you don't belong here." Laughter rippled across the room, the kind that stings more than words ever could. Daniel lowered his gaze, nodding once as if to accept the humiliation. He turned and walked away quietly, his figure swallowed by the glow of the city outside. To everyone inside, the story ended there. The homeless man denied a seat at the table. But the night had just begun. Hours later, those same golden chandeliers would shine down on Richard and his guests in stunned silence, because the man they mocked, the man they cast out, would return not as a beggar but as the new owner of the restaurant itself. The night unfolded like a theater of wealth inside Voss & Company, the most exclusive restaurant in the financial district. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided between tables, pouring Bordeaux into crystal glasses. The air was filled with soft piano music, punctuated by bursts of laughter from men in tailored suits and women draped in silk gowns. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper power. Daniel Reyes had stood at the door only minutes earlier, asking politely for a seat. His voice was steady, his manner humble, but his appearance, threadbare coat, shoes worn nearly through, beard untamed, stood out like a scar against the polished perfection of the restaurant. It was enough for Richard Voss, the millionaire partial owner and self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the elite, to seize the moment. His words cut across the dining room like a whip. "This isn't a shelter. People like you don't belong here." The guests laughed, some covering their mouths with jeweled fingers, others not bothering to hide their amusement. Daniel had nodded quietly, almost as if he agreed, and left without protest. But the sting of that moment lingered in the room long after he was gone. The wealthy fed off it, whispering cruel jokes between bites of foie gras, retelling the scene as if it were the evening's entertainment. Richard basked in it. To him, humiliating Daniel was not just an act of exclusion, it was a reaffirmation of his own superiority. He raised his glass high, offering a smug toast to his circle of investors. To keeping standards high. To keeping the riffraff out. The table roared with approval, the sound of crystal clinking like applause for cruelty. A young waiter who had seen the exchange lingered nearby, uncomfortable. His eyes had followed Daniel as he left, and he whispered to a colleague, "He didn't even look angry. Just certain, like he knew something we didn't." But his words were drowned out by another wave of laughter from the VIP table. The humiliation escalated throughout the evening. Whenever the conversation lulled, someone at Richard's table brought Daniel up again. One man mimicked the way Daniel had asked for a seat, exaggerating the humility in his voice, making the others snicker. A woman waved her hand dramatically toward the entrance. "Imagine him sitting here, among us. I'd lose my appetite." The group laughed again, the sound sharp and cruel. Even diners at neighboring tables, who hadn't witnessed the initial rejection, joined in the chorus. They asked what had happened, and the story spread like wildfire. "A homeless man thought he could just walk in and dine with us," one guest explained between laughs. "Can you believe it? The audacity." For Richard, it was perfect. He thrived on these moments, where his wealth became a weapon and his disdain for others his entertainment. He leaned back in his chair, savoring a rare cognac, confident that the night's highlight would remain his triumph over a man who had no voice. But beyond the glass walls of the restaurant, the city pulsed with life. Daniel walked through the streets, quiet and unseen, but far from defeated. He carried no bitterness in his step, only resolve. While Richard and his guests fed on arrogance inside their gilded cage, Daniel was already moving toward something greater, something that would shake their laughter into silence. Back inside, the restaurant buzzed with indulgence. Richard, enjoying the spotlight, pushed the humiliation further. He called the maitre d' to the table. "Next time someone like that tries to come in, you turn him away at the door. No hesitation. This place has a reputation, and I won't have it stained by charity cases." The maitre d', trained to obey, nodded stiffly, though his jaw tightened at the cruelty. Richard's guests applauded again, toasting to exclusivity, their arrogance peaking as the night grew late. What none of them realized was that their mockery had already written the first chapter of their undoing. Because only hours later, when the contracts were signed and the truth revealed, the very man they had denied a seat would own every chair, every glass, every chandelier above their heads. And their laughter would turn to disbelief, their arrogance to silence, as Daniel Reyes returned, not as the beggar at the door, but as the master of the house. And right here, in this moment of sharp tension, I want to pause and talk directly to you. You've seen Daniel mocked, pushed aside, and treated as invisible, but you also know something the arrogant millionaire doesn't. His story is far from over. If you're the kind of person who believes in underdogs rising and justice being served when no one expects it, then you'll want to stay with us for what comes next. Because the tables are about to turn, literally. And while you're here, don't just be a spectator. Join this journey. Hit that subscribe button and become part of a community that celebrates resilience, courage, and victories against all odds. Together, we can make sure stories like Daniel's are never forgotten. The restaurant pulsed with laughter and clinking glasses when Daniel reappeared at its doors. Hours had passed since his quiet dismissal, but now he no longer looked like a shadow of the night. His step was steady, his posture upright, and though his coat was the same, his presence carried a gravity that turned heads before he even spoke. In his hands he carried a folder, crisp and official, the kind that made even the most arrogant take pause. Richard Voss leaned back in his leather chair, a cigar burning lazily between his fingers. He smirked again when he saw Daniel. "You again?" he scoffed. "I told you, this place isn't for..." Daniel interrupted, his voice calm yet commanding. "You're right. This place isn't for me. It's mine now." Gasps spread across the tables. The air, thick with expensive perfume and roasted lamb, froze solid. Richard blinked, then let out a bark of laughter. "What nonsense are you spitting now?" Daniel placed the folder on the table in front of him and opened it. Inside lay the signed purchase contract, stamped and sealed. The ink was still drying. "I just bought the restaurant," Daniel said simply. "Every table, every chandelier, every bottle of overpriced wine. It's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Faces that had laughed earlier were now pale, mouths agape. A lawyer seated 2 tables away adjusted his glasses and leaned in, scanning the documents Daniel revealed. His brow furrowed, then arched in astonishment. "It's legitimate," he announced to no one and everyone at once. "This man is the legal owner." The ripple of disbelief turned into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, chairs scraped, and the weight of humiliation shifted from Daniel to Richard with a visible thud. Richard's smirk collapsed. His cigar wavered in his hand as he stared at the papers like they were daggers. "You can't just, this place was mine," he sputtered, voice trembling. "I built its reputation." Daniel's eyes softened, but his tone remained unyielding. "Reputation means nothing if it's built on cruelty. You didn't own the laughter, the meals, or the lives that passed through these doors. You owned bricks and mortar. Now I own them. But I intend to do more." The lawyer confirmed again, standing this time. "There's no mistake. The deed has been transferred. Effective immediately." All eyes returned to Daniel. His voice carried through the room, firm yet measured. "No one will ever be turned away here again. Whether they wear a suit or rags, they will be treated with dignity. That's my first rule as the owner." The crowd erupted. Some clapped in awe, others murmured disbelief. But one by one, the applause grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Even those who had joined in Richard's earlier laughter now stood to honor the man who had reclaimed his dignity and rewritten the rules in the same night. But Daniel didn't stop there. He walked to the very corner where he had first requested a seat hours ago, his steps unhurried, his face calm. He placed his hand on the chair and spoke. "This seat, right here, is a reminder. A reminder that kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost everything. Reporters, who had been invited to cover Richard's ostentatious dinner, now turned their cameras and microphones toward Daniel. Flashbulbs illuminated his tired but resolute face. One asked, "How did you manage this? Hours ago you seemed to have nothing, and now you own it all." Daniel gave a small smile. "Because I wasn't as empty as I looked. Sometimes life strips you down to the barest shell, but inside, you still carry knowledge, discipline, and resilience. I saved, I invested, I built quietly in the shadows while the world ignored me. Tonight, I had the chance to act." The murmurs grew into thunder. Guests who moments ago sipped champagne as if nothing could disturb their golden bubble now felt a chill. The underdog they mocked had outsmarted and outlasted them all. Even the chef emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands nervously, then approached Daniel. "Mr. Reyes," he said cautiously, "does this mean I now work for you?" Daniel placed a reassuring hand on the chef's shoulder. "You've always worked for the people who dine here. Now you'll do so without fear of being asked to turn someone away." The crowd erupted in applause again. Yet Richard was still frozen, staring at the contract as though sheer force of will could erase the ink. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it takes to run a place like this." Daniel turned to him, his expression neither vengeful nor cruel. "No, Richard. The truth is, you don't know what it takes. You had everything, and you chose arrogance over empathy. That's why this place is no longer yours." Richard tried to rise, but his knees buckled under the crushing weight of humiliation. His guests avoided his eyes, their loyalty evaporating. The empire of pride he had flaunted collapsed in front of him, brick by brick, replaced by a single undeniable truth: he had been defeated by the very man he mocked. The applause thundered again, filling the restaurant with a sound louder than crystal shattering. Some guests cheered Daniel's name, others wiped tears from their eyes, struck by the poetic justice unfolding before them. And through it all, Daniel remained humble. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't gloat. He simply stood steady, carrying himself with the quiet strength of someone who never needed their approval in the first place. The night that had begun with cruel laughter now ended with stunned reverence. The chandeliers above, once symbols of untouchable luxury, now glowed warmly on a room transformed, where arrogance had been dethroned, and dignity had claimed its rightful place at the head of the table. The applause lingered like an echo in the rafters, refusing to fade even as Daniel lifted his hand for calm. He did not crave spectacle, only closure. The crowd gradually settled, though their eyes still clung to him with reverence. For the first time that evening, Daniel allowed himself a deep breath, the weight of humiliation finally lifted from his shoulders. The restaurant now belonged to him, but victory was not just about contracts or deeds. It was about restoring dignity where it had been trampled. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "Tonight you all witnessed something unusual," he said softly. "But what matters most is not that a poor man became an owner. What matters is that arrogance has consequences, and kindness is never wasted." The word struck like lightning. Some lowered their heads in shame, others nodded solemnly. The ripple of reflection spread wider than any laughter had earlier. Richard Voss, meanwhile, sat motionless in his chair. The man who once commanded rooms with a smirk now looked shrunken, his tailored suit unable to mask the collapse within. His empire of pride had been dismantled in mere hours. "Richard," Daniel continued, his tone not cruel but unflinching, "you denied me a chair at a table. Now you've lost the table itself. That's justice, not because I sought revenge, but because life has a way of returning what we give to others." The audience erupted once again, not in cruel laughter this time, but in a cathartic roar of approval. The sound was thunderous, like a tide breaking against a cliff. Richard buried his face in his hands, and for the first time, silence fell around him. His allies, once eager to bask in his glow, now slipped away quietly, ashamed to be associated with his arrogance. Justice had been served in full view of all. Daniel did not gloat. Instead, he turned his back on Richard and addressed the restaurant staff, the waiters, the cooks, the cleaners who had stood on the periphery all evening. From this moment forward, none of you will be treated as invisible. You will be paid fairly, respected fully, and never asked to deny someone a meal based on their appearance. This restaurant will stand for dignity." Tears welled in the eyes of a young server who whispered, "Thank you," as though the words carried a lifetime of weight. The staff rallied, standing taller than before. Their applause was different, raw, heartfelt, untainted by showmanship. For them, Daniel was not just the new owner, he was a symbol of hope. As the night drew on, the guests began to disperse, carrying with them a story they would never forget. Reporters rushed to file headlines, "Homeless man becomes owner of luxury restaurant." But beneath the sensationalism lay something more enduring, a parable of dignity restored. And when the last guest left, Daniel remained behind. He sat quietly in the very corner he had once been denied, the chair now his by right but taken with humility. He sipped a glass of water, nothing more. The chandeliers glowed warmly above him, no longer cold symbols of exclusion but lamps of justice. He smiled faintly, not because he had proven the world wrong, but because he had proven himself right all along, that worth is never measured by wealth, and power is empty without compassion. Then, rising from his seat, Daniel placed the keys of the restaurant gently on the table. Tomorrow, business would begin anew. Tonight, however, he left as he had entered, quietly, humbly, disappearing into the city's night with nothing but dignity in his heart. The restaurant was his, but his soul belonged to no building, no crowd, no approval. And in that, Daniel Reyes was freer than he had ever been. And that's the power of dignity, stronger than wealth, louder than arrogance, and unforgettable when it shines. Daniel's story isn't just about owning a restaurant, it's about reminding all of us that true worth cannot be denied, no matter how the world tries to measure it. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to rise beyond expectations? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else who needs it today. And if this tale moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our growing community where we celebrate resilience and victories against the odds. Because here, every voice matters. And sometimes, the quietest voices have the most powerful stories to tell.